One of the greatest ideological achievements of liberalism is, as you say, to make democracy synonymous with their oftentimes, especially in the U.S., very anti-democratic process. I think it was Julius Nyerere who said that the United States is a one-party state, but with typical American extravagance, they have two of them, and it very much feels like that.
But this is like, apparently when Obama went to Havana and met with Raul Castro, what was it, 2016, March 2016, I think, Obama said something like, why don't you have two parties? And, you know, why don't you allow other parties? And he said, well, why don't you? And Obama said, well, we do. We have the Democrats and the Republicans. And he said, oh, come on. That's like me and Fidel having our own parties.
That's great. It was spot on. Hello, everybody, and welcome back to Rev Left Radio. On today's episode, I have on the one and only Helen Yaffe to talk about her newest book, We Are Cuba. And it's really a discussion focusing on that period after the Soviet collapse and how the Cubans and their economy were able to keep it going. In the wake of that, some of the reforms since then, the reforms in particular of Raul Castro in 2007, etc. But we cover so much fascinating stuff, including, you know, stories that she tells of Cuban history that I myself didn't even know, somebody who I consider myself to be pretty well read on Cuban history, and she's just a true fountain of wisdom on Cuban history and Cuban politics. And, you know, one thing that really becomes clear in this episode is in direct contradiction to this idea that America likes to spout and its allies, that Cuba is this anti-democratic totalitarian system. It becomes incredibly clear in this episode that Cuba is infinitely more democratic in every conceivable way than anything an American has ever experienced. And I stand by that claim 110%. And you will see why throughout this episode. But I think it's crucial for us to understand this stuff so that we can push back on false narratives and ideological conditioning when it comes to, Cuba and other countries and peoples like it. But also I think that so we can continue to educate ourselves so that we're better equipped to educate others. Because one thing that we talk about towards the end is how the boot of America is still firmly on the throat of Cuba, how the Trump administration introduced yet more, hundreds of more sanctions and restrictions on the Cuban economy on top of the already suffocating blockade that's been there since the revolution in '59. Just absolute cruelty. No reason. It is just to devastate the people because America doesn't agree with the way they run their politics or their economic system or whatever. It is fucking disgusting, and it makes my heart hurt and my fists clench in rage when I just reflect on what the U.S. has done to Cuba. And that's just one example. What the U.S. has done to countries all over this planet. History will look back, and as Fidel said, will absolve Fidel and absolve the Cuban people of their amazing, beautiful, resilient, creative revolution and the ongoing process of staying alive. And history will ultimately, I truly believe, show a light on what the U.S. empire really was. In a post-America world, where the world can look back with the clarity of hindsight and see what America actually did in the world, it will lose its prestigious position as the shining city on a hill, and everybody will see it for what it really is, a cruel, bloodthirsty empire of domination and profit above everything else. But Helen is amazing, absolutely wonderful. This conversation is fascinating, and we've done a lot of episodes on Cuba in the past. We've done episodes on the Cuban Revolution itself. We've interviewed people comrades of mine that have gone down to Cuba and come back and told their perspective. We've done multiple episodes on Che Guevara. One of the episodes we did early on in Rev Left was debunking a lot of the common lies that you'll hear about Che. But we also recently did a collaboration with our friends over at Hammer and Camera on the Soderbergh film Che, I think from 2007 or something, which again we dove into Che's life and his experience. Also have episodes on the Bolivarian Revolution, which Helen mentions in this episode, and she talks about her visits to Venezuela themselves. So lots of stuff in our back catalog to go and help fill out this information, but this episode stands on its own as a really crucial informative doorway into understanding modern Cuba. And that's something we haven't fully covered. And I just will say one more time, we talk about patriotism and whether the left should embrace American patriotism. And I've said all I have to say on that. But I will say I am a patriot. I'm a Cuban patriot. I've never been there, but I am a patriot of the Cuban country, of the Cuban people, and of the Cuban struggle against the patriotism and the entire system of the United States of America. And I will proudly proclaim that patriotism any day and to anyone. All right, without further ado, here's my fascinating conversation with Helen Yaffe on her book, We Are Cuba, as well as so much more. Enjoy.
So my name is Dr. Helen Yaffe. I'm a senior lecturer at the University of Glasgow, and I specialise in Latin American and Cuban development. I have travelled to, studied in Cuba since 1995. And my most recent book is We Are Cuba, How a Revolutionary People Have Survived in a Post-Soviet World, which was published in spring 2020.
Beautiful. And that will definitely be the focus of this conversation. I just want to say I'm absolutely honored to have you on the show. Very interested for a long time in your wonderful work. And it's just a real honor and a pleasure to have you on. So let's just go ahead and dive into the questions. We have a lot to cover here. And I guess the first question, just to sort of orient yourself to our audience, for those who might not know who you are, although I'm sure most of my audience probably has some inkling of who you are. But basically, how did you come to be interested in and ultimately study Cuba? And how would you describe your politics in general?
Okay, so I grew up with left activist parents. So when I was very young, I was on protests against apartheid in South Africa, against deportations, of CND marches back in the day. And so I grew up with, a sort of critical activist mind. And then actually, it was my sister first, my older sister. She went to Cuba in 1994, which those of you who know a bit of the history, at least recent history of Cuba, will know was more or less the worst period of what's known as the special period of economic crisis after the collapse of the Soviet bloc, which I'm sure we'll talk more about. And she just went on a solidarity brigade. The solidarity movement was gearing up around the world. Cuba had been left isolated politically and economically in terms of international trade and everything. And she saw, how difficult the situation is, but also saw the resolve and resilience of the majority of Cubans and their decision to stick with a socialist system, really. So then she came back and said, that was for a few weeks, her visit. She came back and said, well, I'm going to go and live in Cuba for a year. I was 18 at the time. I just finished what we call in the UK A-levels, or rather in England, A-levels. So that's to get into university. And I was like, well, why not? So we went to live out in Cuba in 1995 to 1996. Not quite the worst period. Cuba the situation had started to turn around and recover. And we just went out there on our own and just went to find out about Cuba by living it, find out about socialism by living it. We hitched around the entire island. We found out what it was like to live through electricity blackouts for 12 hours at a time. We had our water cut off. We took bicycles there. We cycled everywhere. 1.2 million bicycles were imported to Cuba, a Caribbean country with no tradition of cycling. But the petrol had dried up, and so Cubans took to bikes, and there we were among them. We went to food markets. We had to learn very quickly that you need to find a plastic bag or a container to ask the farmers to pour the rice in Otherwise you're in trouble. And we learned to treasure, biros and bits of paper, because everything was scarce. There was scarcity and shortages in every sector. So yeah, that was how I first came to Cuba, and I was fascinated. I mean, I think I have rarely met anyone who's been to Cuba, even people who go as tourists just for a holiday, who hasn't been somehow captivated by the island and its people, by its culture, by the warmth, not just of the sun, but of the people, and who hasn't either returned or planned to return. So I then went to university and set up a student society in Cuba Vive Society, and we started to put on salsa nights and then hip hop nights, and raising money to buy material aid for Cuba, focusing on entertainment for young people. So we were buying sound systems to take out to Cuba, and that was working with a solidarity campaign in the UK, which still exists. It's called Rock Around the Blockade.
Yeah, that's absolutely fascinating. Did that experience, you said you were raised sort of by left activists and you had an obvious socialist inclination and you love the Cuban people. Did your politics, was it always straightforwardly socialist? Did it develop over your experiences in Cuba and beyond, or how would you describe that?
Well, what I realized, I mean, what I knew about Cuba before I went out there at the age of 18 is what I'd learned from studying, like, most students in this country, the Cuban Missile Crisis. And I was fascinated, how this small island had such a major impact on the world. The question of the survival of the planet was played out on this island. But when I got there, it was only when I arrived that I realized that I'd had really quite strong presumptions or assumptions about what socialism was like or what Cuba would be like. And I somehow thought that people would be walking around in like uniforms, with the equivalent of Mao's Red Book, and everyone's a sort of, hard red up, red capital and is citing Marx. And actually what I realized is that Cuba is just a country with people in it. And people are good and bad and a mix, and some people are manipulative and some people are incredibly generous, and you have all of that. What you have, and in a way that's more inspiring and more interesting, because I think the way that I phrase it in my book, my recent book, is this is ordinary people doing extraordinary things, because the system, the society creates the opportunities which are discussed in the book, for example, in medical science, innovation, technology, being champions of sustainable development and the education revolutions and so on. So my understanding of the challenge of development has certainly increased. And of what, the next step in my sort of journey was when I decided to do my PhD on the economic work and ideas of Ernesto Che Guevara. Now, most people, certainly everyone listening to your show, I'm sure has heard of Che Guevara. But, when I was thinking about this, it was shortly after the 30th anniversary, or around the 30th anniversary of Che Guevara's death. There was a whole spate of big biographies of Che that were produced, like the John Lee Anderson, and there were other books like Castaneda, Pablo Taibo, and so on. And they had lots of material about, Che's childhood, his growing up, his travels around Latin America, and then his engagement in the guerrilla warfare in Cuba. But when it got to the part of 6 years that he worked as a member of the Cuban government, I remember John Lee Anderson's book said something like, the light was often seen on in his office at 4 a.m. So I was like, well, what was he doing in there at 4 a.m? So then we had Carlos Tablada's wonderful book, very concise, very clear, which had won an award within Cuba on the politics and economics of transition to socialism, and it synthesized Che's ideas. So that was really useful. But then, it's one thing to say that Che believed it was really important to change people's consciousness in the process of transition to socialism in at the same time as trying to raise productivity and revolutionize the productive forces. But my question remained, how did you go about doing that? I mean, it's one thing to say workers need to feel that they are the owners of production and not just, now there's a new administrator, a new manager, but we call them socialists. So somehow, it hasn't changed fundamentally. So what actual policies can you introduce to try and affect those kind of changes and transitions? And, there are great theorists who never get the policy making power that the Cuban revolutionaries got because they seized state power on the 1st of January 1959. So it's a fascinating process. And I think, subsequently, moving on to study more about the political economy of Latin America, I spent time in Venezuela in 2013. That has really helped to develop my understanding of how challenging that process is. Being in Venezuela, 2013, so a long way into the Bolivarian revolution, well over a decade, less than a decade since it was announced by Chavez that they were, going to be building socialism. And yes, it gave me great empathy for how or understanding and insight into how it must have been in those first 2 years in Cuba, where you have these incredible tensions pulling in different directions. So you have, capitalists and private property and all the, market mechanisms and those interests and elites to some extent are still there. But at the same time, you see this process of radicalization, dismantling the existing state apparatus, building up the new apparatus of the state, which also requires training people who can take over and run this. And those are usually the least literate, the poorest sections of the population who have probably been denied access to education or adequate education. They certainly don't have experience of managing the economy. And so that whole process that took place in this very tumultuous transition period, say in Cuba, 1959 to 61, when those socialist planning institutions start to be established or are established, because they actually start from earlier. But being in Venezuela around that time really gave me an insight to those tensions where actually nothing is determined. Nobody knows which direction it's going to go. And, hindsight is a wonderful thing. But at that point, there is this big battle for political and economic control. And it's very difficult to claim that you could see which way it was going, which direction and which forces were going to come out on top.
Mm. Yeah, that's incredibly interesting. And it begs the question what these societies could do if they were completely freed from outside attack and aggression. What Cuba, all the amazing accomplishments a relatively very poor island country is able to do under the stranglehold of a half a century long embargo. How could these flowers of socialism blossom if they were given enough space and time? And now there will always be, I think, internal fights when you try to transition to a different style of an economy, but those can be handled. It's the external pressure led by U.S. imperialism in most of these cases that really puts a lot of pressure economically and militarily on these countries. And so, one of the big tragedies is look at what Cuba has been able to accomplish, and then just imagine what it could have accomplished if it had open and free access to the world economy.
Well, I completely agree. I think that's how I ended my book, We Are Cuba. Imagine what Cuba could do if it was given the space to breathe, if it was given the space to prosper and not just survive. We also have to be clear that the necessity has forced on Cuba certain imperatives. People point this out when they look at the quite dramatic and rapid transition that Cuba made from what was known as the Green Revolution of highly industrialized, mechanized agriculture, very high, extraordinarily high ratio of tractors, per land and use of diesel and chemical fertilizers and so on. And then with the collapse of the Soviet bloc, where it just simply cannot get those inputs, Cuba carries out this, as I said, extraordinarily rapid transition to organic farming. And often people say, oh, well, this is just explained by necessity. But what I've tried to do with my work based on the research that I've done is explain, well, there's two elements there. There is necessity, but there is also capacity. And the capacity is not coincidence. The capacity is the result of a very conscious, directed development strategy. So extraordinarily early in the revolution. I mean, if you can picture the scene, it's January 1960. So one year and 1 week or something after the rebel army has taken over the centers of power in Havana. Mm-hmm. Fidel Castro is still marching down from Santiago. And the illiteracy rate in Cuba was, very high. 2/3 of Cubans, something like that, had either no schooling or 3 years of schooling. So, almost functionally illiterate. The poverty rates, if you look at Haiti today, their equivalent infant mortality, the big difference was between the city and the rural situation where, 40% of children were running around barefoot with parasites in their belly. And in this scenario, Fidel Castro stands in the Academy of Sciences and announces that the future of Cuba will be a future of people of science. We are sowing opportunities, he says, for intelligence, for people with intelligence to contribute to the nation and national development. And, so they followed through with that. They made the relevant investments, social investments in education, in healthcare. And then as they, raised the standard of education, then with their medical science institutes, they had to reach a critical mass. But it's quite phenomenal. If you look, by the 1980s, Cuba has health indicators on a par with the advanced capitalist countries, so Western Europe and the United States, more or less. And it also has just below in terms of the number of scientists per population. So, this is a conscious development strategy. And these wonderful achievements, which I highlight in my book, are the result of that, both the necessity, but alongside the capacity. And I think I have this quote from someone who wrote in Conservation International or some journal, who said, you can't just say that Cuba's achieved what it has in sustainable development because of necessity, because otherwise, Haiti would be an ecological paradise rather than, the devastated environment that it is. So when we talk about what they have achieved, I mean, more medical personnel serving overseas, more development aid personnel serving overseas than anywhere in the world, more doctors per person than anywhere in the world, more art instructors per person than anywhere in the world. A leading country identified in 2006 by the World Wildlife Fund as the only country at that point to have achieved sustainable development, which means improving the standard of living of the population whilst living within the carrying capacity of the planet. First in the world with a meningitis B vaccine. I mean, many medical science first in the world to eliminate mother-to-child HIV transmission. Their record is quite astonishing. And, the UN has these sustainable development goals. And I argue that if you remove the economic measures, then, Cuba is accomplishing most of those goals.
Yeah, crucial insight and very, very important to understand that stuff. And I think I just saw something recently that says that the average Cuban now lives just slightly longer than the average American. America has a lifespan that's actually headed in the wrong direction. As somebody
behind that,
go ahead.
Can I just add, behind that statistic is a very important detail.
Sure.
Because in the United States, you will have massive disparity in life expectancy between wealthy white populations, poor black populations, the indigenous populations all over the Americas. Whereas in Cuba, often the places that have zero infant mortality are rural areas, where the normal profile is they are more starved of resources and they have worse indicators, whether it's life expectancy, infant mortality, or whatever. So it's this incredible equality across the country in terms of all of those statistics.
Yeah. That's a really important point, absolutely. And I just wanted to make the point really quickly as somebody living in America that's always been in the working class. Like, I've never had access to health care. I broke my ankle. I had to deal with that on my own in my house. I've had years of depression and anxiety and never could afford to go see a therapist or get help. When my stepdad had a stroke, as he was having a stroke, he asked my mom and sister not to call the ambulance because of how much money it would be. So this is the stuff that working class Americans have to face. And, to think of that Cuba with a fraction of the wealth of the United States has been able to provide such high quality health care for its people is just really astonishing.
What you say about not accessing healthcare, I find that horrifying. I mean, in Britain, we have a national healthcare service. It's been chipped away. It's been, backdoor privatization, but the essence is still there. I just find it astonishing that a country that treats its citizens in the way that you're describing, or residents in the way you're describing, can have any moral authority to talk about democracy. And, you're comparing the situation with Cuba. And as I said, Cuba meets many of those sustainable development goals. And yet Cuba is not upheld as an example. Right. The opposite is true.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, exactly. Well, your newest book, We Are Cuba, focused specifically on the period after the Soviet collapse and its impact on the Cuban economy. And we've had many episodes on the Cuban Revolution. We've debunked many right-wing lies about Che. We've even had episodes on the Bolivarian Revolution, but we've never covered this specific time in Cuban history with any sort of focus. So I want to do that here. And I think the first place to start is can you talk about the role that the Soviet Union played in the Cuban economy for those several decades between 1959 and the eventual collapse of the Soviet Union, just so we can get an idea of what they did for the Cuban economy before we move into talking about the special period.
Yeah. So like everything, this is, complicated and contradictory. So, but also it's something that we can't understand unless we rewind. I have a terrible habit, historian, of saying, "Oh no, we have to go back further." the point that we have, the context that we have to lay out, is Cuba's utter economic dependence on the United States prior to 1959. So you're talking about 86% of exports were sugar, 80% of them went to the United States. The majority of Cuba's inputs came from the United States. The US had this sugar quota that it could set. So, if Cuban state was misbehaving, they would cut the quota and so on. That was not just for Cuba. That was the system that was used. And, I'm sure your listeners know about the history of the Platt Amendment that gave the United States the right to intervene in its own interest. And it had done that several times. The situation changed after 1933. But, the Cuban economy was very much set up to serve the interests of and structured around the needs of the US or US capital. And this means that the elite in Cuba is also dependent on that relationship, which is, why they defend the relationship tooth and nail, because they're defending their own standard of living and their own privileges. So that's the context, right? Then you have the Cuban Revolution and, Fidel Castro goes to the US very early on. He says, we want to keep trading. We want to keep, carry on. Let's just have a commercial relationship. But the US is not having it. And we know that by sometime in late 1959, they're already planning to overthrow the new revolutionary state. And then, the history is there, the Bay of Pigs. And at this time, the Soviet Union steps in. And so when the US first cuts off the remainder of what the Cubans were due to export in sugar to the United States, they say, we're not going to take that last quota. And the Soviet Union steps in and says, well, we'll take it. And then the tit for tat retaliations continue. The Cubans nationalize the US companies. It doesn't happen in one go, it's incremental. And at each stage, while the US, knowing full well the leverage it has over Cuba through its economic domination, punishes Cuba by these economic measures. And at each step, the Soviet Union steps in. So, I mean, the Cuban leadership is really clear. Che Guevara, I'm sure we can talk more about that. You know, he has very strong critiques of the Soviet economic management system, Soviet political economy, mistakes they're making. He's already saying in the early 1960s that they're headed back to capitalism. But he is very clear that the Soviet Union was decisive in the survival of the Cuban Revolution in that early period of transition and secured Cuba's transition. So this trade with the Soviet Union cushions Cuba from the US blockade. They call it an embargo. The reason that I would argue that the term embargo is wrong is because an embargo is a bilateral question, and it is the sort of prerogative of any country to decide whether or not to permit trade with its own citizens and companies with another country. A blockade, on the other hand, is technically, you know, in old-fashioned terms, a military surrounding of a country, but you know, I don't think it needs to have that component. But it is measures that stop that country from carrying out normal trade and commercial relations and exchange with other countries. And in the case of Cuba, it affects Cuba's relationship with the whole world. So I think it's definitely merits being called a blockade. So the US, you know, we've just had the 60th anniversary of the full embargoes, they called it, of the United States on Cuba. And there are real problems that Cuba suffers because of that. For example, 100% of their capital goods, machinery, equipment, and so on, comes from the United States, 95% of their spare parts. So when you cut off that capacity to access those inputs, Cuba can't get spare parts for its existing machines. The Soviet Union, the whole of the socialist bloc, doesn't have the same machine. So it creates enormous problems. When they start importing from the Eastern European socialist bloc and the USSR, they use a different, you know, electrical system. It's like everything is 60 hertz. So it all has to be adapted before it's sent to Cuba, which uses 50 hertz. I might have that the wrong way around. But you see, there are massive problems. And you know, Che Guevara had this very strong critique of how backward he referred to a lot of the factories and stuff they were buying through the Soviet Union and the Eastern European socialist countries as obsolete, backward technology, even compared to the US corporations that existed in Cuba in the 1950s. So it wasn't all wonderful for Cuba, but it certainly helped Cuba to survive. Now, the Soviet Union, and another big thing is often made in the literature and in commentary about how the Soviet Union was giving Cuba, and it's true, 3 times the world market price for sugar. But just to clarify, only about 10 to 15% of internationally traded sugar at that time was traded at a world market price. So Britain, with its colonies and ex-colonies, had quotas. The United States had quotas, and they were prefixed arrangements. So, you know, the other thing is that this was part of a concept of the socialist division of labor, of the responsibility of the more developed countries, technologically developed, more productive countries within the bloc, to assist the development of the less developed countries by giving them what are called fair prices, that take into account that the countries are starting at different levels of productivity. So you don't have what is called the unequal terms of trade that you have in international capitalist international markets. So this was this was a conscious political policy. On the other hand, the trade, there were benefits for the Soviet Union too. So Cuba has one of the greatest reserves of nickel in the world, And the Soviets needed Cuban nickel. And if they hadn't had access to that, then it would have cost them a lot more to dig it up from, wherever it was. And they also got, obviously Cuban sugar and Cuban citrus and some other things. Now, the downside, so this was a good deal for Cuba, notwithstanding the problems with technology. The downside was that the prices for sugar were so generous that they were a disincentive for Cuba to diversify away from what had historically been the sugar monocrop. And, that was a problem, but no one predicted, well, maybe Che, but it couldn't have been foreseen that the Soviet bloc would collapse. At one point, more than half of the world's population lived in socialist countries. So, it was beneficial for Cuba, but not without problems.
Right. So with all that context in mind, let's talk about the collapse itself. So how did the collapse of the USSR affect the Cuban economy, and what were the main challenges of the special period for Cuban society?
So in summary, the collapse is catastrophic, really, for Cuba. What you see is a 35% fall in GDP. So if you think about, the sort of global recession we've seen falls of 2 to 3% of GDP. But this was, over a 3-year period, a 35% fall of GDP, the kind of thing normally associated with a war, a famine, a pandemic, a really catastrophic situation. And the effects are immediate and very strong. And Cuba is particularly vulnerable to the collapse of the Soviet Union for many reasons, because it's historically as a small island with limited natural resources. It has always been, and no doubt will continue to be, dependent on trade. So a high proportion of what's consumed in Cuba comes through trade. So, if you eliminate 87% of Cuba's imports overnight, it's going to be devastating. And there are, as well as those GDP statistics, you can look at things like manufacturing capacity fell 90%, food imports fell by 66%. At the same time, you're losing the inputs that you need for domestic agriculture. So it was devastating. And I think that there were few in the world, really, certainly outside of Cuba, who would have predicted that the Cubans would have survived. But the Cubans entered a period known as the special period in time of peace. But there's something very interesting about this, because it's associated with the collapse of the Soviet bloc. But it was actually announced and introduced 16 months prior to the collapse of the Soviet bloc. And that was in response to the Soviet leadership starting to cut the special deals, those agreements that we were discussing before, that it had with Cuba. And then the Council of Mutual Economic Assistance, countries were arguing to move onto, international market prices. So it was all slowly disintegrating. But the Cubans went into this sort of emergency phase, this special period phase before the collapse of the Soviet Union. Now, I also spoke to people when I was doing my doctorate, my PhD, which was turned into a book, Che Guevara, The Economics of Revolution. And I was speaking to the people who worked closest with Che Guevara in his economic work. And one of them, Edison Velasquez, told me, this is now published, about this very important material that Che Guevara had written to Fidel Castro before he left Cuba in 1965, where he was reiterating his critique of Soviet political economy, predicting or explaining why he believed that they were headed back to capitalism and the problems that he saw with what he called hybrid system of socialism with capitalist elements. And he sent me this material to Fidel Castro. Now, in the analysis of Edison Velasquez, Fidel had this. He trusted Che's analysis, and you can see what what Fidel Castro's speech, I'd encourage everyone to read it, on the 30th anniversary of Che Guevara's death, where they are just launching this period of rectification, which pulls them away from the Soviet model. And he says, if we'd listened to Che knew that these methods would never be a route to socialism. Che would be horrified if he saw, and he lists all these problems that are happening in Cuba since they adopted the Soviet system of economic management and planning. And he says, I urge everyone, go out and read Che, everyone in Cuba, everyone in Latin America, everyone in the West, everyone in the capitalist countries, you must read, and see what he was saying. So what Velázquez is saying is that Fidel Castro had this warning from Che, and that he had ensured that Cuba had reserved, and that Cuba was looking out for this possibility of collapse. So it's a year and a half before the Soviet Union collapses, even before the Berlin Wall comes down, and Fidel Castro gives his annual 26th of July speech to tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of Cubans. And he says, if one day we wake up to the terrible news that the Soviet Union has collapsed, and apparently, the audience was like, shocked. What does he mean? How could this was not something they could envisage. He carries on, he says, Cuba will resist, and Cuba will remain a socialist country. And he said they will implement a full blockade. They will not allow a morsel of food to come in, a drop of oil, but we will resist. So, they had an idea of what was happening, but they couldn't stop the impact. And the impact was really, as I said, devastating. So, you can see things like the average adult lost 5.5 kilograms of weight in that very short period. They had the emergence of child malnutrition. They had an epidemic of something called neuropathy, which is related to weak immune systems from not having sufficient diets. But they took emergency measures very quickly. They had already prepared all institutions, schools and hospitals to how to deal in an emergency situation where oil is cut out. They had launched a movement to grow your own food, to increase self-sustainability. So this was like the very first period, like a devastating collapse. But very quickly, you see things start to turn around. One of the mechanisms, so many imaginative, creative, collective solutions. So one of them is the one I mentioned on bicycles. Okay, you have no petrol. So buses are parked up in the garage. People are waiting 3 hours to get home for one bus. When it comes, it's already full. So what do? You distribute bikes. So you have, people all over Cuba cycling around. They maintained the ration. The number of goods were knocked off, like rum and tobacco. So it was just the essentials. The ration book, every Cuban has a ration book. They go to the local bodega, the warehouse. It's basically on their street or nearby. And they go and pick up their supplies for centavos of pesos. So even for poor Cubans, it's affordable. They gradually start raising salaries and pensions. They start to introduce targeted assistance. So they work out who are the poorer, more vulnerable families, and they give them extra, either through the ration or social assistance. And, a whole set of measures. What's incredible, there's this graph that I often use, which shows GDP and employment in Cuba. And if you look, what happens to the line of GDP is it just literally plummets. It just soars right down like a slide, right, for a couple of years. It gets to 1993 and then very quickly starts to go up. But while it's going down, the bar lines that show employment are actually going up. So this is an incredible phenomenon. In any capitalist country, when GDP plummets, unemployment goes up, employment goes down. What you have in Cuba is the opposite, because a political decision is taken to keep people employed, even when the inputs haven't arrived, the factories paralyzed. There's no resources to produce with. They're kept on 60% of the salary. Why? To keep them, so they have an income. But secondly, because work is very important politically and socially in Cuba. It's very important politically because Cubans organize through the workplace. They have workplace meetings, the trade unions, the production assemblies. They discuss, debate, argue. Socially, they used workplaces to be able to augment the amount of income and rations that Cubans had by giving them lunches and dinners and so on. So people were also, they remained linked to society and were able to continue to feel that they were making a contribution to social development. So, yeah, I mean, the impact was terrible. There was an unofficial delegation of the IMF that went to Cuba and said, I think this was 1992 or 3, they said, look, if you don't introduce essentially shock and awe neoliberal policies, within 6 months, you'll have a hyperinflation and total crisis. And the Cubans ignored their advice completely. And instead, they went to the population. So they had 6 months of discussion and debates in every workplace and centres. The people debated what reforms can we introduce, what measures will we allow. And at that point, some were suggesting that workers should be taxed. And the response from the population from these debates was, no, we don't accept that workers' incomes should be taxed. So they never introduced it. So this process happened for 6 months. Then they got back together for the second part of the Communist Party Congress, and they approved a set of reforms. But these already had some legitimacy, which increased the likelihood of acceptance, even though they were seen, accepted reluctantly. They had some legitimacy because they had been subject to some public debate. So the reforms that they introduced are vital for their survival. They seriously open up tourism. They open up to foreign investment, but still very controlled. So almost all foreign investment has to enter joint enterprises where they have the minority stake. So 49%, the Cuban state has 51%. They legalized the US dollar. The US dollar was circulating in the black market, and its value was going up and up against the national pesos. They encourage and allow self-employment in a number of non-strategic areas. They allow the opening up of farmers markets, which is something that had been shut down in the 1980s because these middlemen, as they're called, were, hiking up prices and hoarding and so on. And so a number of measures are introduced, and, there are Cubans who are not happy. They see that tourism starts to introduce inequalities in and material aspirations among sections of the population. Some people have access to dollars from the tourists, some don't, and that creates inequalities they're not accustomed to. But those people who feel that also recognize that this is necessary for their survival.
Yeah, the creativity and the resilience of the Cuban people is absolutely astounding, and it shows what can be accomplished when you put people first instead of profit. I am wondering, though, you mentioned these processes of deliberation, the 6-month period, the workplace being a site of sort of a democratic voice of the people, etc. And often in the U.S. and in its ally countries, Cuba is denigrated as like a wholly anti-democratic totalitarian state, compared to the beautiful, flourishing democracy and freedom of a country like America. Can you speak a little bit to that denigration of Cuba as inherently anti-democratic? Because everything you're saying seems to fly in the face of that idea.
Well, I think we need to understand that there are different interpretations of the term democracy and of the term freedom, and even of the term human rights. And, you're interested in philosophy, so I'm sure you're well aware of that. But in relation to democracy, there is a form of democracy which is the favorite of advanced capitalist countries, and sort of parliamentary liberalism, or, in the US, you have the Senate and the Congress, this more or less two-party system. And what has happened is the proponents of that, who are the proponents of, capitalism, have managed to monopolize the term democracy. So that's what it means, right?
Yeah.
So democracy is your two-party system, maybe three-party, maybe one slipped through. In France, there might be more because it's proportional representation. But it is essentially multi-party system with, regular 4 or 5 year elections where you elect professional politicians who receive a salary for the work they do. And they are they have conflicting loyalties between their constituents who vote for them and their party. And we have a thing called the party whip, which they use when they want to make sure that all members of the party are going to follow the party line. So, if that's what you regard as democracy, you look at Cuba, you see it's missing, you conclude Cuba's not democratic. Mm-hmm. But Cuba has a different system of representation, election, and delegation, and decision making and exercise of power. So if you regard those concepts as questions of democracy, then maybe you can open your eyes and actually say, well, what kind of democracy does Cuba have? So they have a process. They have this system of people's power. And it starts from the grassroots up. And in fact, it is at the grassroots level where it is most democratic, it is most organic. So, it starts with street committees, and they have elections in what we call here in the UK wards, so small areas of a few streets. And you elect a representative, and then you elect at a higher level, which is the municipality. We call them here boroughs. So that's a sort of larger area. And the people who are elected to represent those areas are in an assembly, the municipal assemblies. And they're elected every 2 years. There's a rotating electorate. No one is paid for doing that. So these are not career politicians. What happens is they continue to receive the salary that they get in whatever work they do. So there's no material incentive. There's no corrupting, salary that people can get. What you have in Britain is, yes, you can get people from the working class becoming members of parliament, but once their minimum wage is 76,000 or whatever it is now, they totally lose touch with the reality of the communities they came from and what it's like to struggle on the kind of resources that they have. So that's one key tenet, is politicians are not paid in Cuba for that job. And the second one that's really important for democracy is the right to recall. So it only takes, I think, a third or something of the constituents who voted for a candidate to get together and say, we're not happy with the job you're doing. We recall you. Now, how do they know about the job they're doing? Because the candidates have to go back to their neighborhoods at least once every 6 months. And what they call render account. So they have to give an account of the work they've done, the account of the representation they've given, the account of the results they've achieved, and explain them. So it's incredibly, they are accountable to their electorate. So, so then from the municipal level, there was previously, it's just been eliminated with the new constitution of 2019, but the same process happens, or similar process happens at the provincial level, but you have people elected up through the municipal assemblies rather than directly. But you also have representation from the organizations of the masses. So that's the street committees, the Women's Federation, the Small Farmers Federation. So there might be cultural groups and religious groups. They also have representatives in these parliaments. So when you get to the top level, the National Assembly of People's Power, which has over 600 delegates, more or less half of them come through that neighborhood process. So they've been elected from the barrio, from the neighborhood up into the national parliament. And then the other half are representing their organizations of the masses and other social, political, religious, and so on delegates. So you have seats put aside for representatives of the Federation of University Students, for example. I remember going to a very rural place, a very rural community in Cuba, somewhere around Guantanamo or Caimanera, which is the town closest to the US military base on illegally occupied land there. And meeting the local representative in this rural mountainous area and saying to her, how close do you feel to Havana here? How close do you feel to decision making? She said, I'm right there. I sit in Havana and helping to make the decisions in the National Assembly. So, that is a different kind of direct democracy where people are involved. Now, it's also, it's really important to point out that the Communist Party doesn't stand in elections. So these two things are conflated, right? One is there isn't a multi-party system in Cuba. No, it's true. The only political parties allowed or formal and large are the Communist Party of Cuba and the Union of Young Communists, but they don't stand in elections. So they don't put up candidates and they don't stand in elections. That's really important. The other, so it's one thing to say that there isn't a multi-party system, but that gets conflated with the fact that there's only one party. What the Cubans have tried to do is separate, historically, and there's been a lot of debate about this, and Che Guevara has strong views about the need to separate government from the party. So the government is responsible for managing and administering the economy, society, and so on. And the party is responsible for being what they call the ideological motor. And this is something that Raul Castro talked about recently, the need to reinforce that separation between party and government.
Yeah. That's really interesting. I have a picture of Che in my living room because how much I appreciate his contributions to just humanity in general. And the things that you're mentioning about Che throughout this is show his prescience and his intelligence. I think one of the greatest ideological achievements of liberalism is, as you say, to make democracy synonymous with their oftentimes, especially in the U.S., very anti-democratic process. I think it was Julius Nyerere who said that the United States is a one-party state, but with typical American extravagance, they have two of them. And it very much feels like that.
But this is like, apparently when Obama went to Havana and met with Raul Castro, what was it, 2016, March 2016, I think, Obama said something like, why don't you have two parties? And, why don't you allow other parties? And he said, well, why don't you? And Obama said, well, we do. We have the Democrats and the Republicans. And he said, oh, come on. That's like me and Fidel having our own parties.
That's great. It was spot on.
Yeah, it's the same thing.
Absolutely. Yeah, so that's fascinating. Now, we focused a lot on the domestic situation through these years, and I think that's very important. But another thing you do cover in your book is sort of how Cuban internationalism has evolved. So can you talk about how that international, sort of perspective built in, I think, to the Cuban sort of socialist experiment has evolved over the decades, and why it evolved toward medical internationalism in particular?
Okay, so I'm going to do that historian thing of saying there's a long historical legacy of people from other countries fighting in the wars of independence in Cuba, and Cubans fighting in national liberation struggles and anti-dictatorship struggles elsewhere. Jose Marti, who is considered to be the national independence hero of Cuba, he had this concept, right, about Cuba's sovereignty, Cuba's independence being vitally important to secure the independence of the rest of the Americas. Because although when he was writing, it's quite incredible, he was, Cuba was under Spanish colonial rule, and he was killed actually in the final War of Independence in the late 19th century. And the United States was this sort of burgeoning, fairly newly independent country, burgeoning capitalist power. But he foresaw that their sort of imperialist tendencies and their expansion. Of course, they had already taken a third of what was Mexico in 1848. But this was also expressed in their in arguments among the elite that Cuba belonged, like some sort of natural physiology, belonged to the United States. And he warned, while fighting the War of Independence, his final letter before going into battle, that if the United States was allowed to capture Cuba, it would use Cuba as a springboard to expand among over the region in its territorial conquest. So there is this legacy. It's difficult to underestimate the political and ideological influence that Jose Marti has for Fidel Castro and the Cuban revolutionaries. It's a fascinating story, because some of the Cuban exiles, in Miami also lay claim to Jose Marti, but they ignore that part of his obra, of his thinking, of his interpretation, the warning against US imperialism and his promotion of economic equality, racial equality, and social justice. So he was an advocate for those things. For Fidel Castro, he regards the revolution, in fact, is described as Martiana, so influenced by Jose Marti as well as Marxist, Martiana Marxista. So this was part of their vision. So their vision is, their enemy is imperialism and the unequal terms of trade. And the results or the expressions of imperialism and the unequal terms of trade are the devastating expressions of poverty, structural poverty, dependence, subjugated populations, the role of multinationals exploiting people and planet all around the world. So they integrate this vision, right, where they see that fighting for Cuban independence, fighting for equality, economic equality and social justice in Cuba has to be part of a broader struggle of fighting for it in the, as they see it, the oppressed countries, which today we might call the global South. So it's part of, they do not distinguish between, Cuba's national liberation struggle as they saw it, or Cuba's struggle against the Batista dictatorship, which is, to do with the relationship domination of the United States and the struggle to help others. And the other thing is, very quickly, they develop these concepts that, healthcare is a human right, education is a human right, but that's not just a human right for Cubans, that is a global human right. So, then they have to do something about it, to be part of implementing that human right for people all over the world. This starts really early. So it starts in 1960. There's a devastating earthquake in Chile. They don't have diplomatic relations with Chile. There's a not fraternal government there. But they send, and this is the context where, doctors are leaving, medical staff are leaving. They only have, Fidel Castro does a speech, subsequently says, in the first early days, we were left with, there was only 6,000 doctors in Cuba, or slightly over, in 1959, and we were left with 3,000, half of them left. And yet, so they had a massive shortage of medical personnel, and yet they sent doctors to Chile in response to this earthquake as emergency assistance, and there was a massive mobilization nationally to donate blood. So that's the first form of medical internationalism, responding to an emergency situation. But a few years later, they send a team of medics to Algeria, newly independent Algeria, in 1963, to help the newly independent Algerian state to set up a public healthcare system. So then you have a second form of medical internationalism. In the meantime, they originally sent soldiers to assist the Algerians with their national liberation struggle in 1961, and they brought back some children who needed medical treatment and some soldiers. So that was another form of assistance they began developing extremely early, is inviting patients from overseas to treat them in Cuba. And then the fourth form of medical internationalism is to invite foreigners to Cuba to study medicine. So that's it in relation to medical internationalism. But of course, for the first till the 1980s, really till the end of the war when South Africa invaded Angola, there was more emphasis on military internationalism. But what I argue in my book is that Cuba was as ready to send soldiers as doctors, because it saw the conditions as part of the same structural relations. So, why were people dying of easily curable diseases? Because of the same situation of exploitation, which was, called for them to send soldiers. So, so in the first 30 years, their internationalism was more military. So it's really important to highlight here what their contribution to the struggle in Angola. Angola was newly independent state, and it was attacked by attacked by two organizations internally, which were being funded by US and European imperialist powers to overthrow the new radical left state. And at the same time, or around the same time, it's attacked from the south by the army of the apartheid regime in South Africa, which has been illegally occupying Namibia for decades. And Neto, the president, asks Fidel Castro for Cuba's assistance. So initially they send tens of thousands of soldiers. They push back the first incursion, and then they return in the 1980s. And by the end, it's something like 400,000, close to 500,000, 400,000 Cuban volunteers have been to Angola to help them fight for their independence and against these attacks. An incredible sacrifice. And, it was very decisive. Nelson Mandela, when he came out of prison, when he was finally released, the first country outside of Africa that he visited was Cuba. And he went to thank the Cuban people. And he said that there was the decisive battle of Quito Cuanavali, that was militarily and psychologically a turning point for their own struggle within South Africa and Southern Africa against the white apartheid regime in South Africa. But, the other thing is that the Cubans never went to Angola to come away with oil or diamonds or anything else. They never took anything out of that country. If anything, they left the remains of 2,000 Cuban soldiers who sacrificed their lives for that struggle against apartheid.
Yeah, absolutely gorgeous. It pulls on my heartstrings to see that sort of humanity is out there. And there's this interesting parallel because Che himself, one of the founders of the Cuban Revolution, was a doctor and a soldier. And, to think, and a selfless one at that, and to think that those two strains were built in, not just because of Che, of course, but, built into the Cuban society and their social fabric and their vision for what the world could be and their role in it. It's just really a gorgeous, beautiful thing that I think, more people should know about. Of course, here in the U.S., Cuba is nothing but demonized. We're not told any of this stuff. And so you have to go to wholly independent, often left-wing media sources to even hear a story like this. It's very hard even to find that information here.
Well, let me tell you another story. I know
Sure.
You probably want to move on, but in the current context, I think this one is really, really important. In terms of, I talked about programs to invite patients to Cuba for treatment. The largest one of that is certainly, was it the largest? No, I think it was superseded afterwards by Operation Miracle, which was restoring eyesight. But the largest programs of that was the Children of Chernobyl program, which basically inviting kids from the area around who had been affected by the Chernobyl nuclear disaster. So Ukrainians mainly, some people from Belarus, some Russians, mainly Ukrainians, to come to Cuba for treatment for ailments that were associated with the nuclear. And they began this program shortly before the special period. The special period happened, those kind of devastating scenario that I was painting for you. And yet Fidel Castro and the Cubans decided to keep this program running. In the end, after I think it was 13 years of this program, 26,000 people had been completely for free in Cuba for ailments related to the nuclear disaster.
Wow.
And of those, 24,000 were children.
Wow.
Now, Ukraine never paid a penny to Cuba for that. And there was a moment when a Ukrainian president said, we recognize what Cuba's done, we will make a contribution, and never did. And I believe a subsequent president did as well. But, this was, again, after the collapse of the Soviet bloc. They carried on when Ukraine had, was no longer socialist, and they carried on because the priority was human beings.
All right. Yeah. Helping human beings. That is their priority at home and abroad. And it's so rare in this world. And, Cuba goes into a place like Ukraine or helps those kids from Chernobyl not expecting a dime. They just do it for the humanity itself, and that's what makes it so beautiful. Let's go ahead and move on. I know we're over an hour here. I do want to be respectful of your time. It's very late where you are. So I just kind of want to touch on these reforms in 2007. So can you talk about Raul Castro's reforms since 2007, how the country has responded, and sort of the role the Cuban people have played in those decisions in that reform process?
Right. So I think, again, and it's in the, I have a whole chapter on this, or two chapters in a sense, on the reforms that took place from this period. And I think it's really important to get the framing right. So what were these reforms about? Were they about Raul had some, preference for capitalist markets? No, they weren't. It was not about a political preference. It was about searching for ways to increase productivity and productive capacity within a socialist framework. So, I talked to you earlier about the decision to keep workers employed even when, they weren't productive, or productivity was very low. So what happens is this creates this cycle of low salaries and low productivity. And at the same time, around 2000, you have the new burgeoning relationship with Venezuela under Hugo Chavez. Burgeoning, it's blooming. It sets off very quickly. So you have the initial accords of 2000, agricultural accords and agreements, and then by 2004, you have the Bolivarian Alliance for the Americas. You have Cuba sending, by the end of 2004, 10,000 medical professionals to treat people in Venezuela, the poor population. Some say 70% who lived in poverty, who'd never seen a doctor, and the Cubans are there giving them treatment, and they're paid initially in oil, and they set up this sort of barter exchange based on their socioeconomic needs and resources. So the situation for Cuba starts to improve, and they start to see quite significant economic growth, going up to one point nearly 12%. And this creates this means that they have more resources to be able to deal with some of those, what I call the scars of the special period. So measures taken to survive the special period, but which create their own problems as well. So this situation where they estimate they have 1 million people in the workforce who are, unproductive, who are not really needed in the state sector, employed by the state, right? Their salaries are being paid. So they carry out a whole set of measures to deal with these problems. One of the first is distributing idle state land, which is land the state owns. It's not being farmed. It's being taken over by marabou, a very deeply rooted weed. And they decide to parcel it out to families and individuals who can take the land. It's in usufruct, so they get the land free. They don't have to pay rent, but they have to get it to produce within 2 years, and they have a contract with the state to, pass on production to the state. So that's one of the measures. They also need to unclog the situation with housing, because they haven't had resources to build houses for years, and there's overcrowding. So they open up a market. They allow the private sale of houses, which had been prohibited since 1982, and cars the same. So there's an encouragement of more self-employment. So there's this set of measures, but they're all aiming to achieve specific objectives within this framework of socialism. So, the state maintains a monopoly of international trade. That's really important. The state is in control of all of the key sectors. That's really important. The state still controls production and distribution, but they are opening up small spaces for, basically to create innovation and raise production and productivity, mostly in the areas where the state doesn't have the capacity to meet need. So this process happens, and what's really quite phenomenal about it, however, there's two things. One, every time one of these measures is introduced, the capitalist press blows its trumpet. Yay, Raul Castro is embracing capitalism. They clearly show that they don't understand. Then they get frustrated when measures are constrained or rolled back, and they say, oh, it's so frustrating, why don't they understand how to run the economy? But they don't understand the objectives of the Cubans is not economic growth, it's development.
Right.
Yeah, and there's a big difference between economic growth and development, like welfare-centered development. So the Cubans will often not take measures that would be good for economic growth, but bad for some sections of the population, or for equality and social justice, which are key tenets of their development model. This process happens, and they pass something called the Guidelines for Updating the Economic and Social System. This is a document that is drafted. It literally has a number of guidelines. I think the first one had 313 or something. And this document is then printed and circulated to the entire population. This is 2011. The end of 2010 and the beginning of 2011, because the population has 3 to 4 months to discuss, debate, critique this document in workplace meetings, neighborhood meetings, university meetings, study center meetings, wherever they are. And they can participate in as many meetings as they want. And all of their comments are noted down anonymously, and then they are taken away, analysed, categorised, and they have something like 700,000, suggestions and comments from the Cuban population of 11 million. Obviously, that includes kids, the elderly, infirm. But the statistics are nearly 9 million people took part in debates about the lineamientos, the guidelines. And some people may have taken part in 2, one in their neighborhood, one at work. But what happens is that these guidelines are then modified according to the opinion of the population. So, again, going back to that question of democracy, I might have the right to vote in multi-party elections once every 5 years, and my representative can do what they want for those 5 years before coming back and making more promises to me. But do I have the capacity to influence and impact policies about the economy, about what priorities are in our development model? No, I don't. So it's quite a phenomenal exercise, and it is repeated in various ways. So there's another reform that's made to the retirement age, and the same process happens within the trade unions. 3 million trade unionists are part of this, or whatever number it was. A retirement age is debated, and then more recently we've had huge debates nationwide about the new constitution in 2019. So in this chapter in my book, I map some of these debates and discussions that take place. This is really important because the revolutionary generation, the generation of the revolutionary veterans, is passing over. It's handing over. It's already Fidel dies in 2016, and they need to formalize some of the things that happen in Cuba, make decisions about the future direction of the country, and then by putting it through this process of debate, they gain some legitimacy, as I was saying before, and some kind of consensus behind these reforms, because everyone knows that they've been part of the process of, coming up with this new development strategy.
Yeah, and that level of input into your government's behavior is totally alien to Americans like me. And even here, even when we talk about this democracy issue, and we have the right to choose here in the U.S. between a handful of millionaires every couple of years, and even that is too much for the right wing in this country to accept, which has long been on a crusade to gerrymander away votes they don't like, to discredit black votes, make it much harder to vote, etc. So what little democracy Americans do experience, if you can even call it that, is always under attack and always being rolled back. And meanwhile, in Cuba, they have a say in their workplace, in their communities, and in their government's reforms. It's quite spectacular. So let's go ahead and end on this question, which is, just sort of your opinion. Where do you see Cuba going from here? And specifically, I'm wondering what Cuba's approach to climate change has been, because I think I know that will be a primary factor in every society as this century progresses. So I'm really interested in Cuba's person and humanity first approach and how that translates to climate change.
Okay, so I recently helped to co-produce a new documentary about Cuba's, it's called The State Plan to Confront Climate Change. It's known in Cuba as Tarea Vida, which is Life Task or Project Life. And the documentary is called Cuba's Life Task Combating Climate Change. And we made that to be launched during COP26, the International Climate Change Conference, which actually took place here in Glasgow, where I am. So the premiere was attended by Cuba's Minister of Science, Technology and the Environment and the rest of the Cuban official delegation to COP. So it's an incredible, inspiring approach that they have. Again, it's shaped by these external factors, the fact that the United States blockade doesn't allow them to access international financial institutions, even for green funds. There are a few bodies like the UN that have certain green funds that they can access. They've had some financial support from the EU, but very difficult for Cuba to get technology and so on. So their approach to climate change, first of all, I should say, they have this long-term state plan. It was really started to develop from 2005. They had these macro proyectos, big projects to analyze the impact on coasts of climate change. And then under Raúl Castro said this needs to be taken, all this information needs to be turned into a policy. 2017, they approved the state plan, or Tarea Vida, and it has a projection all the way to the end of the century, so almost 100 years. And it's split into stages, so very short term, medium term, and very long term and very long term. And essentially what they do is they have identified the priority populations, because once again, protection of the population is heart and center of their approach to climate change, and the population and the natural environment. So they've identified the vulnerable communities. They reckon 1 million people face, losing their homes and livelihoods because of rising sea levels and destruction to the coast. That's 1 million people in a population of 11 million. And they then, using environmental science, they use natural solutions like sowing mangroves and so on. And here is the key ingredients, once again, community participation. So the communities get involved in the local area. Sometimes the natural solutions are being suggested by the communities who best know their area. They know the environments, they know, the impact of climate. But honestly, we were in Cuba this summer when there was the COVID surge and the 11th of July protests, and doing these interviews, and it was really fascinating to see the level of organization. In this state plan, there are no private interests, there's no speculation, there's no money making mechanisms and so on. This is literally, working out with the national resources that we have that are very limited, how can we protect the population and the environment and the economy from the inevitable and devastating impacts of climate change. And Cuba's in the front line of that. So that's in response to your question about climate change. Our objective was to try and get the message out there that there isn't a Cuban approach, which is very different from the globally dominant paradigm of public and private partnerships and somehow trying to turn a buck, make a buck out of climate change. Mm-hmm. And I'd encourage people to look that up. It's available for everyone to access on YouTube. Your other question about where is Cuba going? Well, this is, this is partly where we have audience participation. I mean, just to establish some facts, Cuba is in a very difficult situation. Since 2017, the Trump administration took a set of sanctions, a blockade that was already nearly 60 years old, nearly 6 decades old, that most of us would have thought, well, what more can they do? And yet, as I said in my book, the title of my book, they've survived. But they managed to find 243 new actions, measures, and coercive measures and sanctions to make Cuba's situation more difficult and more challenging. So, even things from threatening to fine international shipping companies that transport oil from Venezuela to Cuba or from anywhere to Cuba, just making it impossible for Cuba to use the international markets. There are literally less than a handful of banks internationally that will carry out transactions with Cuba because they are terrified by the fines imposed by OFAC, the Office of Foreign Asset Controls of the US Treasury. For many years already, and many people don't know this, they think of the blockade is a sort of bilateral issue that Cuba just can't buy from the US or just can't sell to the US. But part of the blockade says that any piece of equipment or machinery, whatever it is, anywhere in the world, if it has 10% or more of its components manufactured by a US company or a US subsidiary, it cannot be sold to Cuba.
Oh my God.
Everything just becomes extraordinarily complex. And with the banking situation, you have examples where Cuba has already exported stuff, or it has, it had medics providing maternity services on a contract with Algeria, and it can't get the money because the German bank refuses to carry out the transaction with Cuba because they've previously been fined. So, this is just utterly endless. When COVID comes along, I mean, it's just incredibly devastating for Cuba. It was devastating for most of the world, the global south particularly, but for small island nations, islands are dependent on tourism. When borders are shut, when your tourist income completely disappears more or less overnight, it was really, really tough for Cuba. They couldn't get hold of syringes. So even though they had this incredible accomplishment of developing 5 COVID-19 candidate vaccines, so the only country in Latin America and the Caribbean to have produced a domestic vaccine for COVID-19, but they had to appeal to the international solidarity movement to donate syringes because they just couldn't find companies that would sell them to them. So this is a very cruel, difficult dichotomy. I mean, I travel to Cuba fairly frequently, and I can tell you that before COVID in 2019, you were already having serious shortages in Cuba. So the state steps in because it can control distribution and start to ration to make sure you don't get people hoarding, and that, everyone gets a fairish share of a shrinking pie. So there were long queues already in 2019, and then throughout COVID, in from a epidemiological perspective, they've been very strict. So in the hot Caribbean sun, you have to wear your mask, but people are getting up at 4, 5 in the morning to get in a queue for a store that might not open till 10 and 11 if the goods come in. And so it has been exhausting and very, very painful for the Cubans this whole period. And this is extending externally imposed suffering. And it is utterly consistent with the original concept of the United States blockade, when Lester Mallory from the US administration of 1960, April 1960, he wrote a memorandum. What shall we do about Castro was the question. And he proposed an economic brigade to cause, in his words, misery and suffering, so that the people rise up against Castro and the revolution. And that was after recognizing that there is, at present, massive support for the revolution, and that an internal opposition wouldn't be possible. So that's what they've tried to do. And the situation is very difficult. Why did I talk about audience participation? The reason is because, really it's down to us. And I have to say, Breht, more down to you and your audience in the United States to say, are we going to allow this 60-year-old embargo really finally strangle the life out of the Cuban revolution, the Cuban people? Because the situation is so bad. I mean, you have this new movement growing of Cubans who live in the United States, Cuban Americans, Puentes de Amor, Bridges of Love, who are saying, at the moment, they can't send remittances to their families. Lots of flights were stopped. The cruise ships were stopped. Now, Biden has just made an announcement about remittances. At some point, they will consider, there's a foreign company that they will allow. But it's just cruel and unusual punishment. So the question is, will Cuba survive the post-rapprochement period, as I describe it in my book? I mean, it partly depends on whether a significant movement develops in the United States, whether the demand is there to create the political pressure that is necessary for the Biden administration to reverse some of these stringent, very punitive measures introduced under Trump.
Yeah, the amount of suffering imposed on innocent people in Cuba and all over the world by the U.S. government, fills me with rage and heartbreak every day. I think, Fidel once said that history will absolve him. I'm sure that's true. And I know that in hindsight, after post-America, in the post-American world, we will look back and see the true cruelty of the American empire and the amount of innocent people all over the planet that it devastated and destroyed and made life so needlessly difficult for no other reason than their own geopolitical interest and profits, or at this point, just out of spite. I mean, it's absolutely disgusting. And that's the job of Americans, is not to buy into the American propaganda of democracy and freedom and, all of our enemies are terrible totalitarian states, but to challenge it in our communities and our friends circles, and to organize, to put pressure on this corrupt empire to at least get its foot off the throat of the Cuban people. That would be a huge accomplishment of the U.S. left if we could even do just that. My heart breaks every day for the Cuban people, and making the economy scream has been a long-standing strategy, and we're seeing it deployed even today by the U.S. empire against anybody that it decides is its enemy. And it's absolutely cruel, it's inhuman, and it needs to stop. I thank you so much, Helen, for your amazing work. I think the first step is bringing this knowledge and this information to people so that we can take it, give it to our audience, they can take it, talk to their friends and family, and continue educating people in an American context where there is no education whatsoever on the rest of the world really at all, but specifically America's enemies. So, your contributions are crucial for us to be able to take, learn from, and then do the work that we can here in the U.S. So I thank you for that. But before I let you go, can you please let listeners know where they can find you, your documentary that you mentioned earlier, and your books online?
Yeah, so the documentaries are available on YouTube. I have two documentaries I've co-produced which are on YouTube. The one I've been talking about is Cuba's Life Task, Combating Climate Change. The year before that, 2020, the first year of the pandemic, we produced a documentary about Cuba's fairly unique response to the COVID-19 pandemic, which explains how the public healthcare system works, a bit about the biotech sector. At that point, they were just starting to have promising results in their work on vaccines. That one's called Cuba and COVID-19, Public Health, Science and Solidarity. My book is available there. We Are Cuba, How a Revolutionary People Survived in a Post-Soviet World, is produced by Yale. And the previous book, Che Guevara, The Economics of Revolution, is unfortunately ridiculously expensive, and it's really not my fault, so don't get cross with me. But the PhD that it's based on is available on the London School of Economics website for free download. The book is better, but it's it's also very expensive. I'm on Facebook and Twitter under my own name, and should be launching a website fairly soon. Hot off the press, that is.
Awesome.
And then, of course, there's the virtual tour in the United States, which I hope you'll tell your listeners about.
Yeah, when is that?
Starting on the 18th to the 20th of March, with the conference in New York City at the People's Forum, organized by the US-Cuba Normalization Committee.
Nice.
So there's going to be some fantastic speakers. There's also some women representatives of the Cuban Women's Federation who are in New York for a UN conference. And I think they'll be showing our documentary as well. So if you can get down there, definitely do.
Awesome. I will link to all of that in the show notes so people can find those things as quickly as possible. Thank you again so much, Helen, and I really cannot overstate how much I appreciate you coming on. Keep up the amazing work.
Thank you so much, and congratulations on your show and your big audience. This is what we need. We really, I think in some ways the worst thing that the system does is make you feel you can't change anything. So we need these kind of consciousness raising platforms like the one you're creating to share knowledge. Knowledge is power.